Donald Trump may be arming Congress with fresh evidence of his willingness to abuse his office. A stunning three-pronged attack on the rule of law from the commander-in-chief this weekend. Donald Trump expressing his willingness to use his Justice Department to investigate a political opponent. Trump telling Politico he just might talk to his attorney general about a Biden investigation, saying this, quote, "Certainly it would be an appropriate thing to speak to him about, but I've not done that as of yet. It could be a very big situation." House Intel Committee Chairman Adam Schiff sounded off on that comment.
And what is so shocking to me, I served for many years on a democracy commission in the Congress where we would partner with parliaments in emerging countries, emerging democracies, and we would always say, when you win an election, you don't seek to jail the losing side. And here the President of the United States is saying it's perfectly okay for him, and he has said this before, to go to the Attorney General and get them to open an investigation of his arrivals. And sadly, this Attorney General has turned out to be so political and so partisan and so frankly, without integrity, he just might do it. And, you know, that does add to the sense of crisis, that these democratic norms are being broken down every day.
This, of course, comes on the heels of Rudy Giuliani's much ballyhooed planned visit to Ukraine to meddle in that country's investigation into the Bidens, a trip that's been called off due to the bad press it garnered, but the president clearly willing to ask for help from foreign governments. And perhaps the most flagrant foul of the weekend, the president using his Twitter account to harass a witness in the obstruction of justice investigation. That witness, former White House counsel Don McGahn. He's been subpoenaed by Congress and instructed by the White House to defy that subpoena. The president tweeting this about him over the weekend: "I was not going to fire Bob Mueller and did not fire Bob Mueller. In fact, he was allowed to finish his report with unprecedented help from the Trump administration. Actually, lawyer Don McGahn had a much better chance of being fired than Mueller. Never a big fan." And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us on set, Robert Costa, national political reporter for The Washington Post, associate editor for Real Clear Politics, A.B. Stoddard, former chief of staff at both the CIA and the Pentagon, Jeremy Bash, Karine Jean-Pierre, senior advisor to MoveOn.org is back, and New York Times Washington correspondent Mike Schmidt's with us. Mike Schmidt, it's your reporting from Friday night about two efforts on the part of this White House to get Don McGahn to say that the president didn't obstruct justice. Why was that so important to the White House and the president if they felt that the Mueller report totally and completely exonerated him?
Well, what happened here, and this really demonstrates the advantage the White House had with the Justice Department. Before the report came out, the president's lawyers had a sneak peek, had a chance to look at it. And they saw a lot of obstruction stuff, and they saw a lot of Don McGahn. But what they didn't see was a statement McGahn had made to investigators, which is that he never thought the president broke the law. Now, legally, it doesn't matter what Don McGahn, a witness, thought, but politically, and in keeping the president calm, the president's lawyers thought it would be really great to have McGahn put out a statement after the report comes out. It would take a lot of the air out of it. And the White House, before it's released, goes to McGahn's lawyer and asks, will they put out this statement? They considered it. Then the report came out, and they saw all of the obstruction, and they thought it'd be pretty weird to actually put out such a statement, and they didn't, and Trump got upset.
So, Robert Costa, why, if you're the president, are you now harassing on Twitter someone who, if any sort of investigation comes to pass, if impeachment proceedings come to pass on Capitol Hill, Don McGahn will be a witness in the obstruction investigation?
Talking to confidants of President Trump, it's clear that the president believes privately that Don McGahn would be central to any congressional case made against him on obstruction. And as Capitol Hill pursues that testimony, the president, politically speaking and legally, is laying out his own terms and framing McGahn as someone who can't speak to his own intent with regard to the firing of Robert Mueller or anything that led to discussions about that possibility. McGahn's interpretation of intent is everything. That's why he won't issue, as Mike said through his reporting, doesn't want to issue some kind of blanket statement, because the real debate inside of this White House and the whole legal community around this case is, what did did the president actually mean when he took action with McGahn to say do this or do that with regard to Robert Mueller?
So I'm not a lawyer and I've never met Don McGahn, Jeremy Bash, but I read the Mueller report. 5 people say that what the president intended to do was fire Robert Mueller. They include Chris Christie, Reince Priebus, Don. I mean, there are 5 people. They're all quoted. Their testimony is quoted in the Mueller report. Why is this a debate? This seems like a political debate, not a legal question.
I don't think there's any question that the president wanted to get Bob Mueller removed in the same way he wanted to get Jim Comey removed, because he wanted the heat taken off him. He wanted the end of the Russia investigation. I think it's amazing that in Mike Schmidt's reporting, Nicole, we hear that White House officials actually carried the request by the president, apparently to Bill Burke, to Don McGahn's lawyer. Why would White House officials participate unless the president was really putting a strong arm on them, participate in an effort to request that a witness basically cover up the fact that the president was unlawfully trying to obstruct the investigation?
Well, you and I are parents. I mean, we recognize patterns. I mean, isn't there a pattern of constantly trying to change the story of people who have offered testimony that's either legally or politically? I mean, are you really surprised? This is what he did through the whole. And I guess to me, what's most stunning, and I think what you're sort of inching toward, is that the president was acutely aware of the fact that he was not exonerated at all, especially in the obstruction investigation.
Well, he absolutely knew what he did. He knew he tried to obstruct the investigation. And the question really is, I think, for Congress and others to look into is, how did he do it? Did he use the apparatus of his office? Did he use his authority as president? Did he improperly ask people to lie? There are many instances in the Mueller report, if people take the time to look at it and review it, in which the president said to somebody, go ahead and lie. Write a memo to the file that's manifestly false. He directed Reince Priebus to direct the Deputy National Security Advisor, K.T. McFarland, to do just that. And there are many other instances as well. This is going to make great fodder for congressional investigators.
Mike Schmidt, something that you and your colleagues, and Robert Costa, you and your colleagues reported on this as well, was all of the efforts to get the president to sit for an interview. And some of the analysis at the end of the Mueller investigation was that no one ever had a window into the president's intent. Is this reporting from the weekend, the president's tweets attacking McGahn, saying he was more likely to fire McGahn than Mueller? Is he giving us a window into his intent that could damage him in an impeachment proceeding?
I'm not sure. It is sort of an interesting part of the entire thing. The president claims that he cooperated fully with the investigation. Well, the president fully cooperated in the parts he cooperated with. He didn't sit for the interview. And a central question here was, why was he doing what he was doing? Why was he pushing McGahn so hard? And I'm not sure that the tweets over the weekend answer any of that. I'm not sure it gives us any greater understanding. I think the Mueller report has far better understanding of sort of what the president was saying behind the scenes when he took these actions and what he was truly intending to do. As the Mueller report shows, the president really did want to get rid of Mueller, despite what he says now. Look, at the end of the day, I think it's pretty clear, and the president can sense sort of the exposure. The most exposure that he may face is on this question of trying to get McGahn to recant what he said to investigators. After it comes out that the president tried to fire Mueller, that he pushes McGahn to create this fake memo to the file, as Jeremy was saying. And he knows that the best way to go about this in a situation like this, where public opinion, it's a political question, not a legal question, is to attack. That's what he's done for decades, and why would he change now?
Well, he might change now, Robert Costa, because he might face impeachment proceedings or the commencement of impeachment proceedings. And it would seem that this incident that Jeremy and Mike have talked about, and you, for weeks before the actual Mueller report came out, were reporting that the obstruction questions, the conduct that could be construed as criminal obstruction, were always the thing that kept White House lawyers up at night. It would seem that that problem has not gone away in terms of the exposure that the president faces should impeachment proceedings commence.
That's exactly right. And because of those hovering problems, you have the White House asserting executive privilege about McGahn's testimony, delaying the idea of him coming to Capitol Hill and testifying about all of these events. When you talk to House Democrats, they say they really can't build an impeachment case at this time until they hear not just from Robert Mueller, but Don McGahn. If you're going to make an obstruction case to the American people, it's not just political theater for the House Democrats to have in there. It's critical to have a face to the name, to have a voice place to have a story being told about the intent rather than just something people read in the report.
But I'm sorry, Nicole,
Go
can I
ahead,
just add
please.
here? I think one of the things looming over the president is not just whether he's impeached, because I think he probably figures that's a political fight, I'd like that, and I'm not going to be removed from office by the Senate. What's looming over his brain is the fact that Bob Mueller said that I'm preserving evidence because a president out of office is not immune from criminal prosecution. If the president violated the law and obstructed justice while in office, he has criminal liability when he leaves. That's why he's so desperate to discredit Don McGahn, a central witness in the case against him.
Well, you bring up a good point, because if that is the context in which the president has to answer for his conduct, executive privilege isn't going to protect him from Don McGahn.
And neither is anything about being, a non-impeachment or hearings that don't result in his removal from office. Fundamentally, the president faces a much bigger threat to his own personal liberty and freedom.
I want to ask about all of these other actions. We came on the air Friday, and Rudy Giuliani's trip to Ukraine was on. He was heading to Ukraine to meddle in 2 investigations in that country, as is typical in the time of Trump. That trip got some bad press, and it's now been called off. But this picture, AB, of the president harassing on Twitter Don McGahn, the star witness really in the obstruction investigation, a man who really managed to thread the needle, who, as Mike's reported, was willing to say until the day the Mueller report came out that he didn't believe the president had obstructed justice, that the president attacked him on Twitter, that Rudy was on his way to Ukraine, and that the president saying to Politico that he is going to talk to the attorney general about investigating the Bidens. This picture is just stunning. We throw around the words banana republic and an autocracy. This conduct taken together is really chilling.
Well, when President Trump took office, he expected the bummers in the Republican Party to tamp down his controversial conduct. And then they did initially, and over time they've stopped, and they condone it. You have Senator Lindsey Graham basically saying, if I were Donald Trump Jr.'s lawyer, I would tell him, don't come back and face a lawful subpoena or cooperate with a bipartisan investigation on a subpoena that a Republican signed off on. And so everyone around the president who he anticipated would be stopping him become henchmen. He does what he can get away with. He called on the investigation of Michael Cohen's father-in-law. He has done all sorts of things that there's been no pushback to. So the more he sees he gets away with it, the more he pushes. There are no rules. People see a witness tampering tweet about Don McGahn, roll their eyes. And this idea that Biden will be investigated is not news to anyone. I actually think Republicans who are worried about the majority in the Senate, not enough good Democratic recruits, but they're worried nonetheless, could not stomach this Rudy trip, and it wasn't the Democratic response. However, Biden will be investigated, whether it's by Corey Lewandowski or some band of rookies or by the Department of Justice. There's no question that the president believes it's appropriate, that he's going to tell the voters that he was spied on in 2016, and that anyone who's going to be the Democratic nominee is prepared to face that.
Mike, you've reported that the president has sought to use his Justice Department to investigate Hillary Clinton, I believe, and Jim Comey in the past. Does he have in Attorney General Barr someone who will acquiesce to those requests?
I just want to say on the Giuliani point, we spent the last 2.5 years trying to figure out questions like whether Michael Cohen was in Prague to meet with Russians to get dirt. And that was a central sort of question of the Mueller investigation, of collusion and such. And just the other day, the president's lawyer said, I'm going to a foreign country to look for the same type of thing. I mean, it's just look at how far we've sort of come, and sort of, I guess it's an interesting approach on transparency.
Well, Karine, how far we've come, how far we've devolved. I mean, point taken. And I hope we haven't normalized any of that conduct here. We spent an hour talking about it on Friday. But to Mike's point, that they are now doing out in the open. I mean, I think that they feel like committing crimes in the open was part of their defense strategy when it came to obstruction of justice. They're now engaged in this conduct out in the open. Do you think they'll get away with it? And I agree with AB that Biden will be investigated, but there is a huge difference between campaigns engaging in opposition research and outsourcing said opposition research to Ukraine.
Yeah, I would have to say that Richard Nixon must be blushing right now, because the amount of obstruction of justice that's happening just way out there in the open is just dumbfounding. And I think we have to step back for a second, because this has always been Donald Trump. He ran his business like a mobster, right? It was all about loyalty to him, and he took that into the presidency.
Yeah.
So this is really no surprise. And also, the tweeting that he did this weekend, he tweeted about Biden, he tweeted about Mueller, he tweeted about McGahn. Did he tweet about Melania once on Mother's Day? No, not at all. So you see where his head is at. But there is a danger, because the founding fathers anticipated someone like Donald Trump. They really did, and they built the Constitution because they knew that we could potentially get a Donald Trump. What they didn't anticipate is a branch of government, in particular the Senate, led by Republicans, who would not hold him accountable. And that's the danger that we're in. And Democrats have to do everything that they can to get McGahn in front of them, because we need McGahn, we need Mueller, and it's time. Like, you have to bring the public into this conversation, or else, because people are not going to read this report. They're just not. And so that's the way you get the public in. And I do believe they need to start impeachment proceedings, because that's another way to really get that out there. You can get the grand jury documents. There's so much more that can happen if they were able to do that, if they just moved forward in that direction.
Yeah, and I don't know that everyone understands this, Jeremy, but it does trigger a lot of things legally to commence impeachment proceedings, the turning over of the underlying evidence, presenting and making available other witnesses. I want to play you something for all of you that Adam Schiff said about impeachment.
Here, the Trump administration has decided to say a blanket no to any kind of oversight whatsoever. No witnesses, no documents, no nothing. They're just stonewalling. They want to draw this out as long as possible, and we're going to fight it. We are fighting it, and we have to. It's certainly true that these additional acts of obstruction, a president having obstructed the Justice Department investigation, now obstructing Congress, does add weight to impeachment.
I know the political analysis is that, his base is conditioned to all this conduct, and people in the middle, Karine said that, and I'm not sure that you're right. I think a lot of people are buying and ordering the Mueller report. I don't know if they're all reading it, but they're buying it.
But I just feel like this is a way to really bring people in. I think it's 45% of folks are saying impeach Donald Trump. So we gotta have to get that number up, and this is a way to do that.
Obstruction as a behavior does reek of hiding something. It does reek of guilt, and it does seem to push against Trump's brand of going to Washington and draining the swamp, if you will. I'm not sure there's anyone left that believes that anyway, but Schiff seems to have landed on a message that could stick.
I think it's an important point, Nicole, because there is always a tussle between the executive branch and Congress on issues like witnesses, on issues like documents, on issues like executive privilege. That's part of the natural tension. That's appropriate. We want that between our branches of government. But I think, Karine, you're pointing to something very important, which is that the constitutional design contemplated what happens if a president totally goes rogue. What if he completely shuts down his branch, in this case, his branch of government's ability to cooperate with legitimate oversight? What is Congress to do? They can't just say, okay, no problem, we're good. We can't be in a banana republic situation in which the only test of whether you're going to testify is whether you can be physically dragged there. That can't be the test.
Real quick, that's such an important point. This is a crisis moment for Congress about its own oversight authority. This is a branch of government in recent years has seen itself diminished as a legislative body. Congress barely cuts any deals anymore. They barely move legislation. Its function, in effect, is an oversight body. And now you have a president in a historic and dramatic way saying, no thanks, I'm not going to cooperate on any of the oversight. That's why when I sat down with Speaker Pelosi, it was somewhat humorous, but not so much when I asked her about, could you hold people in contempt? Could you jail people for not complying with Congress? Because Congress is used to dealing with people who operate within the congressional norms, executive branch norms. Suppose someone doesn't abide by any of those norms. Can the branch of government actually function?
It's the million-dollar question, right? And it's what everyone's waiting to see how Congress answers that question. Mike Schmidt, we're losing you. Let me give you the last word. In your reporting, it's not clear if Don McGahn refused to put out that statement because he believes, after seeing the Mueller report, that the president did commit obstruction of justice. Do you know the answer to that question?
I'm not sure. I think that that would be something we would see play out on the Hill if McGahn were to go and testify. He would be asked that. Again, legally doesn't mean anything, but politically would give the Republicans a lot of cover. If McGahn was up there laying out these incidents and then said, look, I didn't think it was obstruction, I think that would really help the president. And obviously the president knows that's why he was upset about this. He gets the help that McGahn could give him. But there were some not nice things that the president said about McGahn in the report. And I don't think that helped convince McGahn to put the statement out.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.